The story opens with a high-stakes security breach. The building isn't just locked down, it's been turned into a coffin. It immediately establishes the gravity of the situation. The impenetrable high-tech fortress of the Hang family has been hijacked by federal hackers, and the boss is only 20 minutes away from a life sentence. The rain-streaked windows of the high-rise office blurred the city lights into smears of neon, but inside, the red flashing alerts on the monitors were razor-sharp. Choi Sang-Ho leaned back in his heavy leather chair, a calm, almost amused smile playing on his lips, despite the sirens beginning to wail in the distance. "You're telling me," Sang-Ho said, his voice a low, dangerous purr as he gestured toward the glowing red screens, "that our $50 million security system has just become a federal cage?" Behind him, Nam Ki-tek, the head of security, stood like a statue, his face pale. Baek-hyun, the CFO, was frantically typing, sweat beads rolling down his forehead. "The exits are deadlocked, boss. The elevators are frozen. They've walled us in digitally and physically." Sang-Ho's gaze drifted to the side of the room. There stood Keita, the maid, holding a coffee carafe with steady hands. She had been invisible to them for months, a silent fixture of the office. "What about you, Keita?" Sang-Ho mocked, his eyes glinting with a mix of arrogance and desperation. "Do you have a brilliant plan to save the Hang family empire, or are you just here to make sure we're caffeinated when the handcuffs go on?" His advisor scoffed, but Keita didn't flinch. She set the coffee down with a deliberate clink and reached into the pocket of her conservative dress, pulling out a weathered, hand-drawn map. "The federal agents are looking at the digital grid, sir," she said softly, her voice cutting through the panic of the room. "But they aren't looking at the bones of the building. Your security team knows the exits, but they don't know the escape." The crimson glare of the emergency lights pulsated against the mahogany walls, turning the luxury suite into a rhythmic, blood-colored chamber. Baek-hyun didn't just walk into the room. He stumbled, his expensive silk tie loosened, and his forehead slick with a cold, frantic sweat. In his trembling hands, a tablet displayed a cascading waterfall of red code, the digital obituary of the Hang family's empire. "Boss!" Baek's voice cracked, sounding thin against the low mechanical hum of the building's failing life support. "It's not just a breach, it's a total blackout." Choi Sang-Ho didn't move. He remained seated behind his obsidian desk, the smoke from his cigarette curling upward in the red light like a ghostly vine. He looked like a man watching a sunset, not a man whose life was being dismantled in real time. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes tracking the frantic movement of the numbers on the wall-mounted monitors. "Define blackout, Baek," Sang-Ho said, his voice terrifyingly steady. "I pay you for precision, not poetry." "The feds, they didn't just hack the servers," Baek gasped, leaning heavily on the desk. "They've hijacked the building's integrated operating system. Every door in this high-rise is electromagnetically locked. The elevators are pinned to the lobby. The smart glass windows have been polarized to steel-strength density. We aren't just trapped, sir. We are encased." Nam Ki-tek, the head of security, stepped forward, his hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm holstered at his hip. "The stairwells?" "Deadbolted from the outside," Baek replied, his eyes wide. "They've turned our own security protocols against us. The system thinks there's a biological hazard, so it's sealed every exit to contain the threat. In 18 minutes, the local tactical teams will have the master override keys, and they'll walk right in through the front door while we're pinned here like insects in a jar." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The sounds of the city, the distant sirens, and the drumming rain seemed a world away, separated by layers of reinforced glass and treachery. Sang-Ho finally stood, the movement slow and predatory. He walked toward the window, looking out at the police lights beginning to swarm at the base of the tower like angry fireflies. Behind him, the soft, rhythmic sound of a coffee carafe being refilled broke the tension. Keita moved like a ghost-like grace, her expression unreadable as she placed a fresh cup on the corner of the desk. To the men in the room, she was part of the furniture, a witness who didn't count. 18 minutes, Sang-Ho whispered, more to himself than his advisors. He turned back to the room, his gaze landing on the silent maid. A kingdom for a key, and all I have is a cold cup of coffee. The silence following Beck's grim report was heavy, broken only by the muffled, rhythmic thud of a police helicopter beginning to circle the spire. Inside the office, the atmosphere was suffocating, a mixture of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of fear. Choi Sang-Ho remained at the window, his reflection ghostly against the polarized glass. He looked like a king whose throne had just been revealed as a gallows. A soft, steady rattle of porcelain announced her presence. Keita moved with a deliberate, grounded grace that felt jarringly out of place in a room full of crumbling giants. She navigated the narrow spaces between the high-backed chairs of the men who had spent years ignoring her. She didn't look at the glowing red monitors or the sweat-drenched face of the CFO. She looked only at the cups she was filling. "More coffee, sir?" she asked, her voice low and steady, a calm pool in the middle of a hurricane. Sang-Ho turned slowly. He looked at her, really looked at her for perhaps the first time in the 3 years she had worked for him. To him, she was a part of the architecture, an invisible gear in the machine that kept his life seamless. In his arrogance, he found her composure insulting. He was losing an empire, and she was worried about the temperature of his caffeine. "Look at her," Sang-Ho said, his voice dripping with a cruel, jagged irony as he gestured toward Keita with a hand that still held a smoldering cigarette. "The world is ending, the feds are at the gates, and Keita here is worried about a half-empty pot." Baek Hyun and Nam Ki-tak didn't even glance her way, their minds already in a prison cell. But Sang-Ho stepped closer to her, his shadow falling over her modest dress. "I almost envy you, Keita. No banks to collapse, no legacies to protect, just a mop, a bucket, and a simple life where the biggest crisis is a coffee stain on the rug." He let out a short, biting laugh, leaning in until he could see his own mocking reflection in her dark, calm eyes. "Tell me, in that simple world of yours, do they teach you what to do when the doors disappear, or do you just keep cleaning until the handcuffs click?" Keita didn't flinch. She didn't lower her gaze. She simply finished pouring the coffee and set the carafe down on a silver tray. The clink of the glass was the loudest sound in the room. "A simple life requires a very complex understanding of how things actually work, Mr. Choi," she replied, her voice lacking even a hint of the tremor that had seized his advisors. "You worry about the world you built on top of this land. I spend my time in the world that supports it." She reached into her pocket, her fingers grazing the edge of the weathered map she had carried for years, the one she had drawn while cleaning the vents, the shafts, and the forgotten veins of the skyscraper. The sirens outside grew into a unified, wailing wall of sound, punctuated by the rhythmic thwap, thwap, thwap of a second helicopter descending toward the roof. Inside the office, the air felt thin, as if the building's life support was already conceding to the inevitable. Choi Sang-Ho didn't look at the tactical map on the wall, or the sweat-stained face of his CFO. Instead, he kept his eyes locked on Keita, his expression twisted into a mask of cruel curiosity. "A complex understanding of how things work?" Sang-Ho repeated, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the panic like a blade. He began to pace a slow, predatory circle around her, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. "Tell me then, Keita, since you spend your days in the shadows of this palace, look at us, look at these men." He gestured broadly to Nam Ki-tek, who was checking the magazine of his sidearm, and Byuk-hyun, who was staring at his frozen tablet in despair. "We are the lions of the city, and yet here we are, trapped by a ghost in the machine. Every door is a wall, every window is a cage." He stopped directly in front of her, leaning in so close she could smell the expensive tobacco on his breath. "If you were a rat, Keita, a small, clever rat who knew the dark corners of this building better than the man who paid for the foundation, where would you go? If you knew the bones were breaking, where would you hide when the cats came to tear the walls down?" The enforcers behind the desk shifted, their eyes darting between the boss and the maid. To them, this was a madman's diversion, a final bitter joke before the end. But Sang-Ho's mockery had a desperate edge. He was a man who had exhausted every official avenue, and in his arrogance, he was testing the only variable left in the room, the one he had always deemed irrelevant. "A rat doesn't hide in a cage, Mr. Choi," Keita said, her voice remaining impossibly level. She didn't flinch as his shadow loomed over her. "A rat stays in the walls because the walls were never meant for people. You see a cage because you only look at the paths that were built for you to walk on. You see a deadlock because you think a door is the only way out of a room." She looked past him toward the ventilation grate near the ceiling, then back to his calculating eyes. "If I were a rat in a cage, I wouldn't try to break the lock. I would simply leave through the gaps you were too proud to notice." Sang-Ho's smile faded, replaced by a sharp, cold intensity. The mockery was gone, replaced by a dawning, frantic realization. He looked at the weathered paper peeking out of her apron pocket. "Show me the gaps, Keita, because right now the lions are about to be slaughtered, and the rat is the only one who seems to know the way home." The mechanical whine of the ventilation system changed pitch, a dying groan that signaled the final cut of the building's oxygen scrubbers. On the far wall, the digital countdown clock bled a harsh neon red, 17 minutes and 40 seconds. The sound of a heavy battering ram echoed from the lobby 50 floors below, a dull thud that vibrated through the soles of Sang-Ho's handmade shoes. "Get her out of here!" Nam Ki-tek barked, his patience finally snapping as he moved to grab Keita's arm. "We don't have time for riddles from a girl who carries a mop for a living. Boss, we need to burn the hard drives and prepare for a breach." Keita didn't flinch as the security chief's hand closed around her wrist. Instead, she let go of the coffee carafe, letting it shatter against the marble floor. The sudden violent explosion of glass and dark liquid acted like a gunshot, freezing every man in the room. In the stunned silence, Keita looked directly into Sang-Ho's eyes, her gaze as sharp and cold as the shards at her feet. "Give me 30 seconds, she said, her voice dropping to a low, commanding frequency that bypassed the panic of the advisors. 30 seconds to show you why your security team has already failed you, and why the map in my pocket is the only reason you won't spend tonight in a 6x9 cell." Sang-Ho raised a hand, a silent command that made Ki-tek recoil as if burned. The boss leaned against his obsidian desk, the red emergency lights casting long, distorted shadows behind him. 30 seconds, Keita. Use them well, or Ki-tek won't be the only one who loses his temper. Keita didn't waste a heartbeat. She stepped over the spilled coffee and pointed toward the massive floor-to-ceiling server rack humming behind a glass partition. "Your security team sees a fortress," she began, her finger tracing the line where the ceiling met the wall. They see sensors, encrypted locks, and reinforced steel, but they've forgotten that this building was built in 1924, long before the digital grid existed. You've layered a smart skin over a dumb skeleton. She walked to the ornate crown molding, a relic of the building's original Art Deco design, and pressed a hidden latch that was disguised as a decorative floral carving. While your men were watching the monitors for hackers, the feds were simply cutting the power to the modern bypasses. They've locked you into your own high-tech trap, but they can't lock what they don't know exists. She pulled the weathered map from her pocket and spread it across the desk, covering the useless tablets and reports. 30 seconds are up, Mr. Choi. You can stay here and wait for the battering ram to reach this door, or you can follow the rat into the walls. The map hit the desk with a heavy, parchment-like thud, unfurling across the high-gloss mahogany surface. It was a stark contrast to the sleek digital tablets that had just failed them, a labyrinth of charcoal lines, architectural notations, and precise measurements hand-drawn on aging, yellowed paper. While the official blueprints of the tower showed luxury suites and reinforced vaults, this map depicted a ghost world of service shafts, freight tunnels, and forgotten structural voids. Sang-Ho leaned over the desk, his eyes narrowing as he traced a line that bypassed the entire security grid of the 50th floor. "What is this?" he whispered, the mockery in his voice replaced by a sharp, clinical focus. "The truth," Keita replied, her finger landing on a specific junction behind the office's decorative fireplace. In the 1920s, this building wasn't designed for fiber optics. It was designed for coal, steam, and the silent movement of servants. When they renovated this floor 10 years ago, they didn't remove the old pneumatic tube system or the oversized ventilation shafts. They just built a false wall over them to make room for your server racks. The enforcers crowded around, their breath hitching as they realized what they were looking at. The map showed a literal vein that ran through the center of the building, a vertical escape route that didn't exist on any digital schematic because it had no sensors, no cameras, and no electronic locks. It was a blind spot the size of a city block, hidden in plain sight. "The federal agents are monitoring every door that draws power," Keita continued, her voice steady as the sound of boots echoed in the hallway outside. "They are watching the elevators and the stairwells, but they aren't watching the trash chutes or the old service lift that was decommissioned in the 80s. This map leads to a basement exit that opens into the subway tunnels, 200 yards past the police perimeter." Sang-Ho looked from the map to the woman standing before him. For the first time, the tattoos on his face didn't look like symbols of a predator, but like the marks of a man who finally understood he had been looking at the world with his eyes closed. The simple maid hadn't just been cleaning his office, she had been cataloging his cage. "Keita," Sang-Ho said, his voice cold and decisive. "Grab the essential drives. Beck, leave the tablets. We're going into the walls." He looked back at Keita, a grim respect etching his features. "Lead the way, Keita. If this map is real, you won't be cleaning offices tomorrow. You'll be owning them." A heavy crash vibrated the office doors. The feds were at the inner perimeter. Without another word, Keita moved toward the fireplace, her hand reaching for the hidden latch that would lead them into the dark. The heavy thud of a breaching ram echoed from the corridor, closer this time, vibrating through the floorboards like the heartbeat of an approaching beast. Nam Keita, his instincts honed by decades of tactical warfare, lunged forward. His large, scarred hand reached out to snatch the weathered map from the desk, his face a mask of aggressive skepticism. "This is a joke," Keita snarled, his fingers curling toward the parchment. "Boss, we are being hunted by the most sophisticated task force in the country, and you're looking at a doodle on a napkin? This girl is a distraction. Move, now!" But before his hand could touch the paper, Sang-Ho's arm flashed out, pinning Keita's wrist to the mahogany with surprising skeletal strength. The room went dead silent, the only sound the distant wail of sirens and the heavy breathing of the trapped men. Sang-Ho didn't look at his head of security. His eyes remained fixed on the intricate, charcoal-drawn veins of the building displayed on the map. "Touch it, and you'll be the first thing I leave behind for the feds," Sang-Ho said, his voice a low, lethal silk. Keita froze, his eyes widening. "Boss, look at the time. We have minutes. She's a maid. She cleans toilets. You're gonna bet our lives on a service tunnel that hasn't been used since the Great Depression?" Sang-Ho slowly released Keita's wrist and straightened his silk tie, his composure returning with a chilling, focused intensity. He looked at Keita, who stood perfectly still, her expression as unreadable as the ancient stone of the building itself. "Precision, Keita," Sang-Ho murmured, gesturing to a specific section of the map where a vertical shaft bypassed the electronic sensors of the 49th floor. "Look at the scale. Look at the cross-referencing of the steam pipes. This isn't a doodle. It's an autopsy." He leaned in closer to the paper, his finger hovering over a hidden junction box Keita had marked with a tiny, precise X. "Your sophisticated security team looked at the cameras. She looked at the architecture. You looked at the software. She looked at the bones. And right now, the bones are the only things that aren't lying to us." Sang-Ho turned his gaze at Keita, a predatory spark of genuine intrigue in his eyes. He realized then that the simple life he had mocked was merely a mask for a mind that saw the world in layers. "She didn't just find an escape route, Keita. She found a blind spot in the entire city." A second crash splintered the outer office door. Dust shook from the ceiling. Sang-Ho grabbed a heavy silver letter opener and drove it through the map, pinning it to the desk as if to claim the knowledge for himself. "The map stays in my head," Sang-Ho commanded, his eyes locking on Keita. "And the girl stays by my side. Move the desk, open the hearth." The shadows cast by the emergency lights flickered as dust began to drift from the ceiling, shook loose by the heavy impact of a tactical ram against the outer corridor doors. Choi Sang-Ho didn't flinch. He remained hunched over the hand-drawn map, his eyes tracing the intricate charcoal lines that promised a world outside his digital cage. "Explain it," Sang-Ho commanded, his voice low and urgent. "Why is this path invisible to the systems I paid millions to install?" Keita stepped closer, her finger landing on the central core of the building. "The hybrid escape relies on the fact that your security team replaced the nervous system of this building but ignored its skeleton," she began. "The feds have hijacked your integrated operating system. They are monitoring every door with an electronic strike, every elevator with a logic board, and every stairwell with a motion sensor. They've turned your high-tech network into a digital net." She traced a line from the fireplace toward a vertical void that ran parallel to the main elevator bank. "But this building was completed in 1924. Beneath the fiber optics and the smart glass is a massive network of manual overrides, the dumb grid. These are the gravity-fed laundry chutes, the manual pulley shafts for the old service lift, and the subterranean steam tunnels. They don't draw power, they don't have IP addresses, they don't exist on the grid because they are entirely mechanical." Baek-hyun, the CFO, shook his head in frantic disbelief. "The sensors would still pick up the heat signatures, the motion." "Not in the service core," Keita countered, her voice sharpening with authority. "The main steam pipes for the entire block run through the central shaft behind that hearth. They generate so much ambient heat and vibration that they create a permanent blind spot for infrared and acoustic sensors. To your security software, that shaft is just a white noise zone. It's been filtered out of the monitoring loop to prevent false alarms." She looked at Sang-Ho, her expression resolute. The feds are waiting for you at the points of logic, the exits the computer says you must use. We're going to use the points of physics. We're going to drop through the spine of this building using gravity and manual gears, moving through the one place where their technology is stone blind. Sang-Ho straightened up. A grim, admiring smile touched his lips. He realized that while his men had been obsessed with the power of the future, Keita had mastered the persistence of the past. "The logic is sound," Sang-Ho whispered, glancing at the door as the wood began to splinter. "The world is watching the screens while we disappear into the brick." He turned to Nam Ki-tek. "Move the hearth, now." The hearth groaned as Nam Ki-tak and the enforcers threw their weight against the iron-bound frame. With a screech of rusted metal giving way to sheer force, the back of the fireplace swung inward, revealing a dark, yawning cavity that smelled of ancient soot and damped concrete. The transition was immediate and jarring. One step took them from the world of Italian marble and climate-controlled luxury into a raw industrial throat that seemed to swallow the red emergency light of the office. "The service lift," Keita whispered, pointing toward a cage of heavy steel mesh and oxidized iron cables. It was a skeletal contraption, a relic of the building's 1920s construction that looked more like a diving bell than a modern elevator. Sang-Ho stepped into the narrow space, his tailored suit instantly catching a layer of gray grime from the mesh. He looked around the cramped, lightless shaft, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. Behind the cage, the massive, rhythmic thumping of the steam pipes vibrated through the floorboards, a subterranean heartbeat that made the very air tremble. "Into the belly of the beast," Sang-Ho murmured, his voice sounding hollow in the vertical tunnel. As the team squeezed into the lift, the sense of hierarchy that had defined them for years began to dissolve. In this narrow, dark shaft, Baekhyun's expensive tablets were dead weight, and Ki-tak's tactical training offered no defense against the suffocating claustrophobia of the building's inner workings. They were entering the invisible world, the service layer where Keita had spent her years unnoticed, mapping the veins of a giant. Keita reached for a heavy manual iron lever. With a sharp tug, the mechanical gears began to grind. There was no smooth digital ascent. Instead, the lift lurched downward with a violent, jarring shudder. The cables groaned, protesting the sudden weight, as they began to descend into the blackness. Above them, the muffled sound of the office door finally splintering under the federal ram echoed down the shaft, followed by the frantic shouts of agents entering an empty room. Sang-Ho looked up at the receding square of red light, then down at Keita, who stood at the controls with a calm, practiced hand. "They're looking at your desk, Mr. Choi," she said, her eyes fixed on the passing floor markers painted in fading white lead on the concrete walls. "They're searching for a man who lives in the penthouse. They aren't looking for the people who move through the shadows." The descent was slow and agonizing, each floor marked by the clatter of the iron cage against the guide rails. They were no longer the masters of the city. They were ghosts drifting through the hollow bones of a fortress that had turned into a trap, guided by the one person they had spent years pretending didn't exist. The lift stopped with a bone-jarring metallic clang, the floor indicator showing a space between levels that didn't exist on any commercial map. Keita slid the mesh door open, revealing a horizontal maintenance duct barely 3 feet high. It was a narrow, lightless throat of rough concrete and jagged iron rebar, coated in a thick, velvety layer of decade-old soot and industrial grease. "Through here," Keita directed, her voice echoing flatly in the confined space. "It's a lateral bypass that connects to the old incinerator flue. It's the only way to cross the security line without triggering the weight-sensitive floor plates in the main hallway." Choi Sang-Ho stared into the hole. To a man who wore $4,000 suits and moved through the world with the grace of a predator, this wasn't just a tunnel, it was a grave of filth. He looked at the grime-slicked walls, the oily puddles of stagnant water, and the cobwebs that hung like rotted lace. For a moment, his pride flared, a sharp, stinging resistance to degrading himself in the dirt. The sound of muffled shouting and the heavy thud of flashbang grenades detonating far above shattered his hesitation. The lions were being cornered, and the king was being forced into the mud. "Get in," Sang-Ho commanded, though the order was as much for himself as for his men. He dropped to his knees, his silk trousers instantly soaking up a cold, oily sludge. The transition was visceral. He began to crawl, his shoulders scraping against the low ceiling, the rough concrete tearing at his tailored jacket. Behind him, Baek-yun let out a whimpering gasp of claustrophobia, and the heavy breathing of the enforcers filled the tunnel like the sound of trapped animals. The air was thick and hot, smelling of scorched metal and waste. Sang-Ho's hand sank into a thick black grime, the literal filth of the building he claimed to own. Every few inches a rusted pipe or a sharp edge of tin ductwork snagged his skin, leaving stinging tracks of red against the black soot. "Keep moving," Keita's voice drifted back from the front, calm and detached. "We are directly beneath the server room. If you stop, your body heat will eventually trigger the environmental sensors in the floor above." Sang-Ho gritted his teeth, the taste of copper and dust filling his mouth. He was no longer a boss, he was a body in a pipe, stripped of his elegance and reduced to raw survival. He realized with a jarring clarity that the simple life he had mocked was far harder than the one he lived. Keita didn't just clean this world, she mastered it, navigating the grease and the dark, while he sat in the light, oblivious to the machinery that kept him elevated. He pushed forward, dragging his ruined pride through the dark, following the silent girl into the very bowels of the earth. The vibration of the steam pipes changed from a low hum to a violent rhythmic thrumming that rattled Sang-Ho's teeth. They were deep within the building's interstitial space, huddled in a narrow utility junction where the ancient brick met modern drywall. Keita held up a single dirt-stained finger to her lips. The silence she demanded was absolute. From the other side of the thin maintenance partition, a sharp metallic clack echoed, the sound of a tactical boot kicking a doorframe. "Clear left," a voice barked, muffled but terrifyingly close. "Check the floor panels. The thermal scan showed a spike in this sector 30 seconds ago." Sang-Ho froze. A bead of sweat, dark with soot, rolled down his forehead and stung his eye, but he didn't blink. He was inches away from a federal agent's weapon. He could hear the heavy, measured breathing of the men on the other side, the rustle of their Kevlar vests, and the distinctive chirp of their radio headsets. "Nothing here, sir," another voice replied, his footsteps echoing directly against the wall Sang-Ho was leaning on. "Just an old janitorial closet and a dead-end pipe chase. The heat spike is coming from the main steam line. It's washing out the sensors." "Damn these old buildings," the first agent grunted. The wall trembled as he leaned his weight against it, just inches from Sang-Ho's shoulder. "Boss is convinced he's still in the penthouse. If he's not there, he's a ghost." The sound of their footsteps receded, moving back toward the main corridor. Baek-yun, the CFO, let out a shuddering breath he had been holding for over a minute, but Nam Ki-tek instantly clamped a hand over the man's mouth, his eyes wide with a warning. Keita didn't move until the faint static of the radios faded into nothing. She leaned closer to Sang-Ho, her voice a ghost of a whisper. "They are trusting their technology. They see the heat of the pipes, but they don't see the shadows hiding within it. We have to move now. When they realize the penthouse is empty, they'll start a floor-by-floor physical sweep. The white noise of the steam won't hide us from a flashlight." Sang-Ho nodded, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the adrenaline of the hunt. He looked at the soot-covered maid, the woman he had called a rat only an hour ago. She had just stood inches from his downfall and hadn't flinched. "Lead," he mouthed. She turned and began to navigate a vertical iron ladder that disappeared into a dark, narrow flue. They were no longer just escaping a building. They were slipping through the fingers of a giant, guided by the one person who knew exactly where the grip was loosest. The air in the tunnel grew sharper, shifting from the stagnant, metallic heat of the building's core to the damp, salt-tinged breeze of the city night. Keita paused at a heavy iron grate, her hand steady as she worked a manual locking mechanism that had been painted over so many times it was nearly invisible. With a rhythmic, heavy clunk, the panel swung outward. One by one, they spilled out of the dark, emerging into the dim, fluorescent flicker of a commercial laundry loading dock. The transition was surreal. They had traveled only 2 blocks geographically, but they had crossed a universe of security perimeters. Behind them, the towering glass monolith of the Hang family headquarters was illuminated by the frantic, rotating strobes of dozens of police cruisers. From this distance, the sirens sounded like a fading memory. Sang-Ho stood among the heavy canvas bins and the scent of industrial detergent, his chest heaving. He looked down at his hands, stained with soot, grease, and the literal dust of the empire he had nearly lost. His $4,000 suit was shredded at the knees, a ruin of silk and grime. Beside him, Baek-hyun collapsed against a wall of folded linens, gasping for air, while Nam Ki-taek instinctively scanned the perimeter, his weapon drawn but lowered. The street outside was quiet, a nondescript alleyway where the only sound was the hum of a nearby transformer and the steady pitter-patter of the rain. There were no flashing lights here, no tactical teams, no handcuffs. They were ghosts in the middle of a city that believed they were currently being cornered 50 stories above. "The van is parked at the end of the block," Keita said, her voice as calm as if she were announcing a coffee refill. Her conservative dress remarkably intact compared to the wreckage of the men's attire. "The plates are clean. They're looking for a motorcade of armored black SUVs, Mr. Choi. They aren't looking for a laundry delivery." Sang-Ho turned to look at her. In the harsh, overhead light of the dock, the scars on his face seemed deeper, but his eyes were clearer than they had been in years. He looked at the high-rise in the distance, then back to the woman who had led him through the mud to salvation. The hierarchy had been permanently shattered. The man who sat behind the obsidian desk was gone, replaced by a man who realized that the most powerful weapon in his arsenal wasn't a gun or a ledger. It was the woman everyone else had been too proud to see. "2 blocks," Sang-Ho whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You took us 2 blocks, and you might as well have taken us to another country." He signaled to Ki-taek to stow the weapon. They weren't just escaping, they were being reborn in the shadows of this simple life he had once mocked. The rainy street corner was deserted, the air smelling of wet asphalt and freedom. A nondescript white delivery van sat idling at the curb, its engine a low, steady hum that promised distance. Before stepping inside, Choi Sang-Ho paused. He turned back, looking up through the drizzle at the distant silhouette of his skyscraper. From this vantage point, the top floors were a crown of chaotic, pulsing blue and red lights. Federal agents were likely tearing apart his mahogany desk at this very moment, searching for a ghost who had already left the machine. Beside him, Baek-hyun and Nam Ki-taek were shadows of their former selves, their suits ruined and their expressions haunted by the narrowness of their survival. They looked at the van as a sanctuary, but Sang-Ho looked at it as a laboratory. "They'll spend all night searching the digital logs," Sang-Ho said, his voice no longer a mocking purr, but a cold, appreciative rasp. "They'll check the flight manifests and the port security. They'll look everywhere the logic tells them a man of my stature would go." He turned his gaze to Keita. She stood by the van's sliding door, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The soot on her face couldn't hide the sharp, calculating intelligence in her eyes, the same intelligence he had dismissed as simple only hours ago. "You didn't just save my life, Keita," Sang-Ho continued, stepping closer. "You exposed the rot in my foundation. I spent millions on men who watched screens, while the woman who watched the walls was the only one who truly understood the house." Nam Ki-tak shifted uncomfortably, realizing his role as the shield had been eclipsed by a woman with a hand-drawn map. Sang-Ho reached out, not to dismiss her, but to gesture toward the seat beside him in the van, a seat usually reserved for his highest-ranking advisors. "The Hong family needs a new architect," declared Sang-Ho, his voice carrying the weight of a final decree. "Not for the buildings we own, but for the paths we take. Tomorrow, the feds will announce that I've vanished, and when I reappear, I won't be building fortresses with digital locks that can be turned into cages." He climbed into the van and looked out at the city lights one last time. The hierarchy was gone. The old order had been dismantled in the soot of a maintenance shaft. "I used to think you were part of the scenery, Keita," as the van pulled away into the night, blending perfectly into the urban flow. "But I realize now that you were the only one actually seeing it. From now on, you don't clean the board, you help me play it." The van disappeared into the rain, leaving the federal sirens far behind in a world that no longer knew where to look.